Hi everyone, welcome to the final module of this class, module number 6. So let me share the screen and go over the slides. So today, in our last module, we're going to focus on the theories of behaviorism, cognitive, and social learning. For many of you, this is kind of a refresher on material you have covered in other courses. These concepts are really prevalent in the social sciences and even in the fields of education, especially when you get into applied behavioral analysis. And essentially what we're talking about is how our personality is greatly influenced by the consequences of our behavior as well as the rewards and even possible punishments that occur in our environment to either reinforce or decrease the likelihood of expressing certain thoughts, feelings, and actions. So let's give some context comparing it to other theories we have covered so far. The big thing to remember with the behavioral, cognitive, and social learning theories is that many of them are in response or rejection to either psychodynamics and the humanistic approaches we've previously covered. And again, there's been a lot of back and forth. So psychodynamics really came on the scene, especially starting off in Europe, where a lot of our behavioral elements strive from the early days of Ivan Pavlov's research in Russia, as well as the birth of American psychology with Watson and then even with William James and pragmatic views. And so we have these theories don't exist in a vacuum, but they do play off each other. And especially in the United States, behaviorism has a strong identity, especially when it comes to American psychology. So instead of trying to understand the person, we're really going to break the person down quite a bit. So again, it's going to be kind of the opposite of humanism, which is the holistic individual, and it's going to be rejection of psychodynamics because certain elements of cognitive, behavioral, and social learning, you don't necessarily need to understand the strong historical element of this person to understand their personality, nor do we need to know what's happening internally per se. Essentially, a lot of these theories really kind of focus on what's happening in the moment. And the main element of these theories is what maintains the personality of a person, as well as how we could change the personality by really focusing on specific elements of either the environment, the person's thoughts, as well as possible consequences for why they behave that way. In addition to these theories, they are a clinical theory because they're highly utilized, especially in our modern world, in clinical settings. But they still have a lot of connections to trait theory as well as biological perspectives. So, what is interesting, some of these elements today, we're focusing on human personality, but a lot of behavioral modifications not only can change human behavior, but we know impacts animal behavior. And what I mean by that, our first kind of foray into behavioral modification comes from Ivan Pavlov's experiments with dogs' digestive system. In addition, if you've ever trained an animal, you are using learning theory as well as behaviorism to reward the animal for performing a task you would like, as well as taking away some sort of or adding some sort of consequence for behaviors that you do not like. So again, it's one of the personality theories that does not is not just limited to human behavior, but also animal behavior as well. So there is a biological element connected to that. So the big thing too, we're going to step away from looking at the individual as a whole, and again, we're looking now at really traits and behaviors of the person. So again, a lot of this is going to be a refresher for you. So let's start with classical conditioning. Made famous by Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov, and this began with research on dog digestion. I'm going to kind of skip all the details of how he discovered this. Essentially, you're probably familiar with as well. But the big component of these experiments was the really emphasis on classical conditioning. And classical conditioning is pairing a natural response, so in the dog's case, salvation, with an unnatural stimulus, i.e. a bell tuning fork. So what that means is the dog naturally is going to salivate with certain stimuli, such as maybe the smell of food. And what we can do is we can take that natural response and we can cause it to occur by an unnatural or artificial stimulus. So the artificial stimulus could be a tuning fork. So every time the tuning fork occurs, the dog has learned that food should be associated. But the beauty comes with this is that even if food's not associated, the tuning fork will still create the salvation response. So over time, an unnatural stimuli will create a natural response. So if we look at this in personality, is over many different conditions and uh, consequences our behavior has created within us almost reflective patterns of how we should behave and act in a good in a certain situation. So essentially with classical conditioning, the biggest thing is we have a stimulus and then we have a response. So if we look back at our traits, a certain stimuli is going to create a certain response in your personality. And we all have different experiences and different environmental situations. And so the same stimulus shown to me that's shown to you still mean we may have different responses. But if we're in the same environment and the right conditions exist, we could actually be modified to respond the same way with the same stimulus if we were in the same environment with the right conditions. Okay, so that's classical conditioning. The other component now is operant conditioning. So this comes quite a few years later. And really the big significant contributors, we have John B. Watson and B.F. Skinner. So essentially with classical, we have stimulus creates a response. And now the next kind of element of this equation is the behavior is going to result in a consequence. So before with Pavlov, what comes first dictates what comes next. Okay, so stimulus creates some sort of response, some sort of action. And this way, what comes after our action is going to determine if that action or behavior is going to occur again, or if it can be modified. So what comes after the behavior, the consequences, is going to influence future behaviors. Consequences that increase future behaviors is known as reinforcements, and consequences that decrease future behaviors are known as punishments. Again, this is language specific to this model. Consequences can be person specific, meaning we all have various preferences and dislikes. So that's key when we're talking about behavioral modification. We need to understand the person's likes and dislikes because what is reward and for one person may actually be a punishment for someone else. So let's take teenagers for example. Historically, if a teenager did something unacceptable, a punishment may be go to their room, right? But now, because of just the age of the internet and technology, the room being secluded to a room may be reinforcement because we have access to internet, access to phones, video games, etc. It may be a stronger reinforcement area than it used to be. So we really need to understand the likes and dislikes of an individual to use operant conditioning to modify behavior. So reinforcements and punishments can be given. So let's say you do something well, I give you a cookie, or it can be taken away. Instead of having you do chores, I say, you know what, you don't have to do them today, you did so well. Or let's say I was giving a test in this class, everyone was doing well, I decide, you know what, you guys have done well, I'm going to take the test away. So reinforcements and punishments can be given and can be also taken away. So when a consequence is added, so when we give something, we call that positive. When a consequence is taken away, subtractive, that is a negative reinforcement. So positive and negative don't have moral values. They just mean if something was added, like an equation, that's a positive. When something is taken away, that's a negative. Again, it's not a moral judgment. It's what is added or subtracted. So there is much debate on the nuance in how we label positive and negative reinforcements. So example, is a timeout a consequences that is added because you give a timeout, or is it a consequence that's subtracted? I am taking you away from the situation. So you can see it's nuance on how we label certain events, but essentially these principles are rather a punishment or reinforcement can be given or taken away. So next is social learning theory. Again, I'm sure you have been exposed to this in numerous classes. Social learning theory was made famous by Stanford psychologist Albert Bandura. And the thing is, we do not just learn from what happens to us, but we can also learn by seeing what happens to other people. So in families, for example, the firstborn is mainly going to experience what happened to them because they don't have any other siblings to look at for. But the following children can do a lot of learning from the mistakes and accomplishments the firstborn child has made. So that can be social learning component. We see social learning occur all the time. So by watching someone else and what they do and the consequences of those behaviors, we can learn from that. So behavior again is really going to be consistent on the environmental factors as well as the personal factors that occur. Let's see. So again, I'm struggling whether or not to go over the Bobo doll experiment, but essentially to give a quick snapshot, because again, I'm sure you've heard this one many times. The Bobo doll experiment was, to break it down very completely, if children observed a older adult interacting with the Bobo doll, they're going to respond in a very similar way. So for example, if the adult was treating the Bobo doll with respect, hugging, holding, the children observing most likely would repeat that behavior, and vice versa. If the adult was punching or being violent against the Bobo doll, the child most likely would do the same thing. So really social learning is how we observe other people behaving can influence how we behave as well. There's also a lot of sociological concepts wrapped into this too, because how a person is perceived, whether they have prestige or even if they're a pariah, is going to limit how much we're going to learn from them. So for example, if we see this person that's engaging as a role model, someone we care about, that may influence us. Vice versa, if we don't have a lot of respect for this person, that can influence us in different ways as well. There's a lot of factors that go into social learning. So to give a brief summary of learning theories, behavior, so our personality, and really when we're talking about these theories, personality is something that we can observe, again, like traits in a way. So it's going to be caused by what comes before, so that's classical conditioning. What comes after our traits are expressed, that's operant conditioning, along with the social environment we're in, social learning. Therefore, behavior can change by changing what occurs before, aka the antecedent, the activating event, what occurs after, i.e. the consequences, as well as the social context environment. So the thing I want you to take away with all these theories is we, if we have many options on how to modify personality, we can focus on what kind of stimulates this personality trait when it occurs. We can deal with the consequences when the personality trait is presented, so deal with the after effects, as well as we can influence the social context, i.e. the environment, to modify behaviors. So there's a lot of flexibility in how to utilize this. Um, and if we can control a lot of these variables, we're going to have a lot of impact. These theories work amazing in laboratories because we do have the ability to control a lot of variables. So we go back to a Skinner box where we have a pigeon in a controlled container, and we can control the food, the lighting, the heat. We can control everything in the environment in order to influence the pigeon's or animal's behavior. We can have a lot of success with this. However, in the real world, we may not have as much control on the environment as we would like. Still, these ideas have a success rate, but there is something lost when we go from the laboratory to the real world because we don't have as much control on a lot of these variables. So when looking at the personality development and change through these models, it's important we gather as much objective data, so that's data we can observe and even quantify, as humanly possible about a subject. So we want to know the before, the after, and the environmental impact that has on that person. So anyone who's experienced with um, applied behavioral analysis, behavioral therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, etc., there's a lot of data collection. It could be logs, behavioral logs, thought logs, just keeping track of what you do during the day. If we collect all this data that's objectable, means I can view it, then we can modify and manipulate the situations to promote the desired behaviors we would like. So again, we're going to look for the when the behavior occurs, where it occurs, what happened before, what happened after, and the context or the environment of when that behavior is not occurring or is occurring. So you want to look for exceptions as well as promotions. Okay, that's really the gist of your big old behavioral and social learning theories. Now we're going to get into the cognitive. So why these, there was a time in the field of personality as well as psychology and clinical psychology where cognitive theory was not, excuse me, cognitive theory was separate from behavioral theory. And oddly enough, cognitive theory actually has more um, kind of flavor of classic psychoanalysis originally being developed than now it is. Let me rephrase that. So originally, cognitive theory was closer to psychoanalysis in its early heyday, but now it's become more of a behavioral camp. But because cognitive theory is really focusing on people's perceptions and what's occurring inside, but they integrate extremely well with the learning theories, i.e. behaviorism and social learning. So what we mean by cognitive thoughts is cognition is the in-between stimulus and response. So going back to classical conditioning, we're going to have a stimulus and then we'll have a response. In this model, in between the stimulus and response, there was a thought. So the light turns on in my room, and then I have a thought, and then I respond a certain way. That is a really crappy example. But essentially, when we're looking at behaviorism and social learning, when all that's occurring, an individual can have thoughts as well. Those thoughts can influence how someone responds and acts. So a response is going to include actions, more thoughts, and feelings and emotions. So what I mean is I could have a thought. So here we go. I have the stimulus that my stomach growls, okay? I have the thought that I'm hungry. So then I can have various responses. An action could be that I go to the fridge and grab something to eat. Another thought could be, well, I'm hungry, but I can't eat right now. I could then start fantasizing on what I want later on. And then I could also have feelings and emotions. Maybe there's shame of being hungry at this moment because maybe I just ate. Maybe there's excitement because now I'm looking forward to what I'm going to eat later, or etc. So when we have a thought, that could lead to an action, could lead to more thinking, and could lead to more feelings and emotions. So again, similar to behavioral elements, if I change the thought, then that can influence the behavioral equation. So if we change the thought, we're going to change the behavior, and vice versa. So again, cognition is going to be person specific, where people may have various thoughts to a specific situation, which can lead to various behaviors. So that's a big overwhelming theme of this is everyone's how someone responds to something is going to be person specific. So if you want to modify that behavior, you're going to really have to understand that person. So there's going to have to be a knowledge of their awareness, their likes, their dislikes, etc. That's the best way we can kind of influence behavior. So that is a very quick runaround. To summarize again, when we look at these areas of personality, it's really focusing on how the environment has influenced our personalities through various rewards and punishments, as well as observing and learning from others. In addition to that, our thoughts and how we perceive the world can, can influence what is expressed at a certain moment, as well as any of these variables that influence our behavior can also be changed. So we know environment is huge in expressing our personality. We know our past is important with that as well. And we know that our thoughts can influence our feelings and behaviors. So therefore, if we change the environment and we change the consequences of a behavior and then address the thoughts related to a personality expression, that can promote personality modification. All right, this is a very short introduction. I know you're all busy. It's the end of the semester. And also you have the final biography going on. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you. And we're going to end there. Have a good day.